In this video we're going to look at overpaid rent and how we handle that in the REI Master program. We have three examples that we're going to show you. The first one being where a tenant has paid more rent than is required to bring them up to their vacate date. The second example will be where a tenant has vacated but they have not stopped their direct debit or credit of rent into your trust account, i.e. then that all of the rent monies that's been deposited needs to be returned to the tenant. And the third example is where a tenant is entitled to a refund of rent, but that money that they paid has already been dispersed to the owner. So how do we get that money from the owner back to the tenant in the new month? In this example, a tenant has paid an amount of funds into the trust account. Only a portion or a part of that money needs to go towards rent. The rest can be returned to the tenant. How do we handle that? Well, let's have a look. If we go to the tenant record first of all, into this one here, Groves, into the tenancy info here, we can see that the tenant is currently paid up to the 24th of December here. If we have a look at their lease and vacating, we can see here that the tenant will be vacating on the 10th of January and that their balance due is $1,050 or 17 days worth of rent. Now we're going to assume that the tenant has paid 3 weeks worth and that is $1,350. So as we can see, only $1,050 is necessary as rent. The extra $300 can be returned to the tenant. So this is how we can do that in the REI Master program. We go to our receipts, we pick up the tenant that is paid the money there, we select under the item drop down list here rent, and again what we can see here is that it gives us an indication of the vacating date and the amount of money that is due. So as I mentioned, we're going to assume that the tenant paid 3 weeks worth or $1,350. However, only $1,050 is required there, so I can type in the $1,050 as the vacate amount. What that then shows me is that is the rental payment from the 25th through to the 10th, which as we can see is the vacating. If I tried to record more than that amount, if I tried to put in $1,200, I do get an indication or a prompt telling me that the amount must not exceed the vacating amount of $1,050, so I need to enter an appropriate amount. So you can see here I can only enter up to $1,050 at this point in time. So let's just complete that again. $1,050 will bring the tenant up to the 10th of the 1st, which as we can see is their vacating date. We can save on that now. So we've got a receipt total so far of $1,050, but as I mentioned, the tenant had paid 3 weeks. So the extra $300, we just record that or receipt that here as a deposit. And in this area here under the details, we can be very clear about what it is. And then we put in the $300 as the amount, tab away from there. So we now have our receipt total for $1,350 of course, and we can see that the breakdown there is for the rent portion and some overpaid rent which will be going into the deposit ledger linked to the tenant there. Direct credit, select your correct payment method of course, save on that there, confirm your details where necessary, and obviously print a receipt as necessary. If we close out of here now, we go back to the tenant record. If we have a look in the tenancy info, we can see now that the rent has been paid up to the 10th of the 1st, and if we go to the lease and vacating, we can see there that there's no balance due, as we've just receipted that amount there, clearly indicated in the account area here as that portion of the receipt of $1,050, and then the other line there, which as I mentioned was the $300 going into the deposit ledger. So the owner will be receiving the rent of course, but that deposit amount will sit in the deposit ledger linked to this tenant. How do we return that money to the tenant? Very simply of course, we draw a payment from the trust account by going to payments. We select the payment type, whether it be a cheque payment, an electronic payment. In my case I'm going to do a cheque. If you have account details for your tenant of course, you could do an electronic payment to them. Select your date as necessary, confirm that the correct check number is showing there, and of course we now need to put in the check payee, i.e. being the tenant, and we're drawing funds of course from the deposit ledger. When we receipted that money, the $300, we selected it as a deposit, so it went into the deposit ledger here, and we can see it sitting there now. We click on that to select that amount for payment. Click on there now, and as we can see, it's a refund from the deposit ledger. When we select save, of course, we are completing our payment in the REI Master program. I go to my reconciliation here. I can clearly see down here on the 18th of this month, I'm going to write out check number 2 to the Groves, who are the tenants in that particular unit or property, and it'll be $300 which is going to be returned to them. So very simply in this video we have identified an amount of money that has been deposited into the trust account by the tenants. A portion or part of that needs to go to rent. The remaining amount of course we've put into the deposit ledger or receipted into the deposit ledger, and then drawn a payment returning that money back to the tenant. In this example, we're going to have a look at funds that have been deposited into the trust account by a tenant who has vacated but has not stopped their direct debit or direct credit of monies into the trust account. How do we handle this monies and how do we return it to the tenant? Let's have a look now. First thing we need to identify is the tenant record. Is it still showing as an active record in our list here? We're going to look at a tenant called James Aldrin, and in looking here we can see that they're no longer showing as an active tenant. If we show in the inactive records, there is their information there. So in order for us to receipt this money against the tenant and then draw a payment to return it to them, we need this tenant's record active. So let's just reactivate that now. We double click on the record there. We can see that there's a tick in the inactive box there. What we need to do is modify and then tick that box, or untick that box as it were. We're then asked, do we want to make the current record active? Yes, we do. We click on that and click Save Changes. And then we can close that record. So you'll see now in our list here that Aldrin is no longer showing as an inactive record. If I go back to active records, there is their record showing there. We can now close and do our receipt for that tenant there. By going into the receipts and we're doing funds received from tenant, we can see the tenant's information showing there. If you can't see it there, you must, as we have just done, check to see if the record is active. Double click again so we can do our receipt for them. Now the monies that's been deposited, as we mentioned in our example beginning there, was rent monies paid by the tenant. We can have a look there, and instead of selecting to receipt it as rent, because it's not rent that the tenant's paying, it's monies that needs to be returned to them, we're actually going to receipt it as a deposit. And in doing so, the monies will then be linked to the tenant in the deposit ledger, but monies won't be then allocated to the owner for disbursement. And in our details option here, we can actually overwrite and put in a description. So very clearly, we're going to put in there, overpaid rent to be returned to tenant. We then obviously insert the amount that's been paid. In our case, $520, or a week's worth of rent on their direct debit. And of course, again, our payment method, clearly it's a direct credit because we've seen it appearing on our trust account statement. So from there, we can then save that information, confirm your direct credit details here, and save on there. So that monies, if we close out of here now and go back to our tenants list, we look in the tenant's record here. What we can see is a couple of other payments they made for rent, and then this one we've done now, overpaid rent to be returned to tenant, $520. So as I mentioned, we receipted that as a deposit, so it's linked to the tenant, but it's not been allocated for disbursement to the owner. So what we can do now to return that money to the tenant is draw a payment from the deposit ledger. We close out of there. So we're going to draw a payment We select our payments button there. We need to determine how we're going to return that money to the tenant. Is it a cheque we're going to write out, or is it going to be an electronic payment, i.e. we're going to transfer the funds from our trust account back to the tenant's nominated account. Your choice on the payment method there. I'm going to select the cheque, just in our example here. Our date there, that's inserted automatically there, and our cheque number. Should always check the cheque number or the next blank cheque in your book that it matches the correct one in here. The cheque payee, of course, in our case is the tenant, Mr. Aldrin. And we're drawing funds from the deposit ledger. When we did the receipt, of course, we allocated that monies to the deposit ledger via deposit. So we can see here the monies that's sitting in the deposit ledger, $520. We tick that one for payment and then hit select. And what we show here is a deposit refund of the $520 on behalf of tenant Aldrin, our cheque payee there, of course. And so what we can do now is write out that cheque, number 3, as we can see there, to Mr. James Aldrin, and we save on that there. So what we have, if we go into our reconciliation now, scroll to the bottom of our list, we have a couple of other receipts of monies that we've been doing. We reach this one here, which is our receipt of the $520 into the deposit ledger, and then this second line here is our acknowledgement of the cheque that's to be drawn and the debit of monies to be paid back to the tenant there. So we've very clearly got a paper trail in REI Master that what will match to the receipt of the monies on our trust account statement and the payment and then from the trust account via cheque there. So in this example, we have identified an amount of monies that's been deposited into the trust account by a tenant who's vacated but has not stopped their direct debit or direct credit of that funds into our account. Please remember as well, if you did have to, with your tenant record in the initial instance, reactivate it, make sure you go in and inactivate it again. Very easily done by double-clicking into the record, modifying and placing a tick into the inactive tick box there, clicking yes to make the tenant record inactive, and saving your changes. Identify and ask or answer the correct information here about incomplete or future recurring inspections. Do we want to remove them? Yes or no? You make your decision on that one there. And what we have then done, of course, is inactivated that tenant record, no longer showing in our current list there, now showing back in our inactive record. In this example, we're going to look at a change of vacate date against a tenancy, which means that the tenant is then entitled to a refund of rent. However, the monies that they paid in rent has already been dispersed to the owner as part of an end of month procedure. So how do we get some monies back from the owner to give to the tenant? Well, let's have a look at that now. The first thing we'll do is go into the tenant's records and just have a look at those first. So the two tenants we're going to discuss are this one here, the Dixons, who were occupying 7 Peter Parade, and the Champions, Mrs. and Mrs. Reed and Peter Champion, who are going to then occupy the premises there. We'll have a look at the Dixons first. In our example, they broke their lease and vacated the premises. They were obliged, of course, to continue paying the rent until a new tenant was found. And so in our lease and vacating area here, now that we have found a new tenant, the Champions, we can apply a vacate date to the Dixons. So we select the modify record, we tick the box to apply a vacating date, and we put in the vacate date that's required. So the Champions are going to occupy the premises from today, the 6th of the 1st. So that means we have the Dixons paying money up until the 5th. So if we select that date there and calculate a final balance due, we're given a prompt here that indicates that the vacate date is less than the pay to date, therefore the amount due would be a refund. Is this correct? We know that it is, so we'll click yes. And what it's given us there then is that there's a balance of $480 or 7 days worth of rent that is due back to the Dixons. So we save our changes on that one there, and we've got that indication there of a refund due to the Dixons. We close back out of there. We go and have a look at the Champions tenant record here. The Champions have paid an amount of rent. Let's have a look in here. So they paid a deposit earlier. That deposit was absorbed to rent and shows from the 6th through to the 19th of the 1st at $1,000. So there's clearly enough rent money's been paid by them to the owner of the premises. Now let's have a look at the owner, because the owner is the person we need to take the monies from in order to return or refund the Dixons. If we have a look across here, we can see the Champions going to occupy 7 Peter Parade, the Dixons linked to that one there, and what we can see there is the Doors are the owners of that property. If I just scroll across a little, you can see there the rental property the tenant's linked to and the owner of that rental property there. So very quickly we can get to the Doors owner. Two ways of doing that. One is to close this list, open up the owners list and go to the Doors. The other way would be use the records and click through to the links that show in each record to get to this part here. Now if we go into the account area for this owner, this is the monies they received in this month. So we can see that there is enough funds there available for us to return a week's worth or $480 to the Dixons, who were the previous tenants. What we need to take into consideration, of course, is that the Doors would have been charged some commission on the $480 that the Dixons paid. So we need to return that commission to the owner first from the business ledger in order then to draw a payment of the $480 to return to the tenant. In order to do that, we need to do a journal of monies from the business ledger to the owner, and that is done in this way. Process and select the journal option. Select the date that's appropriate. We'll leave it as today and we'll give a short journal narration. Now I'm going to copy my little journal narration because that will be a good description to put in on the journal option there as well. So we select our ledger type. We're taking money from the business. As I say, we're just going to paste in that one there. And our account code for the refund of commission here is MGT for management fees. If I tab across, the GST component or the tick box there will be included. Now we're taking money from the business ledger. As I mentioned earlier, $480 was the amount of rent that we need to return to the Dixons. We need to calculate how much commission we need to charge, or sorry, we need to refund to the Doors. Now I can tell you based on the information in the property record that the Doors are being charged 8.8% commission on the rent collected. So what we need to do is calculate the 8.8% amount, $480, which I've calculated here as $42.24. So you do need to calculate your commission amount from the percentage that's charged to the owner in order to insert a figure here. So I'm going to type that one in there. Okay, and we'll tab to the second line. The owner is going to be the recipient of this money, or the person who'll be credited. So we select the owner in the ledger type. Under the reference here, Doors is the owner, and again in here I'm just going to paste my little description here. MGT, again as I mentioned, is the account code we'll use, and again by using the tab key it will complete the tick for me in the GST box. Now the Doors are to be credited, so we go to the credit column and fill in the same amount there. Again tab away and we've got our total debits and credits matching here. So we save on that there, and if I go to my owner record, into the Doors and into the account there, we can see there a refund of commission or credit of monies being given to the Doors. What we're now going to do then is draw a payment from the owner to give that money back to the tenant who is entitled to it. So what we need to do there is close out of here, into the payments option. Again, you decide how you're going to pay the tenant, whether it be a cheque you're going to write or whether it be an electronic payment if you have their account details available. I'm going to select the cheque option here, and again we identify the correct cheque number based on the blank one in our book, and the cheque payee of course is the Dixons. We then select to draw funds from the owner ledger, being Mr. Dawes here, and it tells us or shows us here that there's sufficient funds in order to draw a payment from him there. So what we're taking is $480. Now that is rent monies, so it doesn't include GST, so we must remove the tick from there. And this is refund of rent to Dixon. And our expense code here, we have the option to select one. We're going to use this one here, owner payments / receipts. And the property, of course, is linked 7 Peter Parade. So we confirm our information, $480, refund of rent to Dixon, under the expense code, owner payments / receipts, and we select OK on there. This is exceeding our spending limit that's been nominated here, but we do need to give this refund of rent back to the tenant. If in the case of the amount of spending limit there, you may need to discuss your options there with the owner. We'll click yes to continue. No, we have not included GST on this transaction. That is correct. And what we've got showing here in our transaction summary is a refund of rent to Dixon of $480, no tax included, on behalf of owner Dawes, and monies will be paid to Dixon, the tenants. So we save on that there. We go back to the owners list under Dawes in the account area here. We can clearly then see the check here, number 9, with a very clear description of $480 being paid back to the tenant to refund them for rent paid past their vacate date. So in this video, we've had a look at how we refund an amount of rent to a tenant where the vacate date has changed and they're entitled to a refund, where monies has been paid out to the owner in the previous month and we're using funds that have been collected on behalf of the owner in the new month.